Welcome to Hardboiled Software. I'm your host, Dave Larrabee. Today I'm joined by Steve Elliott, the founder and CEO of .work, a company we're proud to partner with. Steve is a serial entrepreneur with 5 successful exits under his belt. His previous company, AgileCraft, was acquired by Atlassian in 2019, and he went on to serve as head of product there. He's also the co-founder of the Uncertainty Project, a community-driven playbook for better organizational decision-making frameworks, and the author of the book, The Decisive Company. Steve has been chasing the problem of strategic alignment for quite a long time now, asking questions like, how do you connect what executives want to achieve with what teams are actually building day to day? And what he'll tell you is that the first generation of tools didn't quite get there. In this conversation, we dig into why that gap persists and what it would take to actually close it. Steve walks us through concepts like flexible ontologies, knowledge graphs, and durable contexts, the technical foundations of how .work is building what he calls an organizational operating system. But where this conversation really comes alive for me is at the intersection of AI and organizational intelligence and design. Steve makes a compelling case that the biggest opportunity for AI isn't the task level stuff like code generation, it's system level intelligence that actually understands how your organization thinks, decides, and learns. It's a fascinating conversation whether you're a leader trying to connect strategy to execution or an engineer wondering why your priorities keep shifting. Let's get into it. This is episode 3 of Hardboiled Software with Steve Elliott. Welcome, Steve Elliott, to the Hardboiled Software podcast. I'd love to kind of kick these things off and just get a little bit of an origin story. A couple things I have here for you is how did you kind of pivot from consulting into this serial software entrepreneurship role you've had for quite a while now? And let's start there.
Sure. Yeah. So I I did computer science and business undergrad, not really knowing what I wanted to do. And so I went into consulting. And again, it wasn't like I had a plan. I just ended up going to one of the big 6 at the time and working on technology problems with large organizations. So I didn't realize it at the time, but such a cool experience. So you take somebody who's learned concepts, throw them into a big organization, you're supposed to be there to give them advice and help, and you really don't know much. And so it is a great way to get in and learn really fast. And so that's kind of how I came up. And it was really cool because you get to see how decisions are made in large organizations, kind of the challenges they face. But what I loved about it was it seemed like after every engagement, every month, I would get to see another company and then another company and another set of problems. And so, you think about people who join one company and work there for 3 or 4 years, and that can be a great experience, but just coming out of school, getting to see a bunch of companies really quick and then being expected to be a bit of an expert in things was a great way. It was an up or out situation for sure. So it was a great place to start. It just taught me a lot about, how they plan and how these cycles work. And so that led me down a path pretty quickly for my career. And so, I kept seeing these repeating problems. Started out working in security, and you'd come back a year later and you'd see these same. Started out working on segregation of duties in ERP systems was one of the big problems I focused on. And, you give them a report, they mitigate, you come back a year later, a new set of issues, right? And it just kept happening. And so that's what led me down the path of, I was a software person to begin with, but you're like, well, we need a more programmatic way to approach this because, you don't need to pay us, $50,000 a year for the report. You need some software that just helps you keep this stuff tidy all year, all the time, continuously. And then you can pay us for the software, right? And so that's really what led me down the decision of moving towards software was trying to help the customer solve the problem. It just wasn't satisfying to issue a report. It was more satisfying to help them try to actually solve the problem in a more permanent way. And so that's really kind of what led me down the path.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're going to get into the .work stuff in a minute. I just love your vision for that. So we'll unpack that quite a bit. In just setting some kind of stepping stones, where and when in that journey did you kind of recognize strategic alignment as a problem that it seems like you would keep chasing over a couple of startups and maybe are even still, having your kind of crosshairs with .work? Where did that set of problems and can you describe what that problem looks like for people that maybe aren't as familiar with it or aren't in those kind of rooms and conversations?
Yeah, no, that was another stark one. Once you get out there and start working in some large organizations and just seeing it up close. So like when you're talking with teams who are on the ground doing the work, a lot of really smart people, very capable. They've got a plan. They're working on the plan. They're delivering the plan, right? And they're going through that process, and that looks good. And then you sit with the executives and they've got strategies and they've got ideas about how the organization should move. But then when you start talking to them about what the other one is doing, right? So in a large organization, you're talking about thousands of people, right? So very large, very complex. And so, up at the leadership level, you're talking to them and they're talking about, well, this is the direction we want to take the company. This is what we're trying to do. And, they set goals. They talk about the goals that's supposed to flow down through the organization, and the organization lines up to what the company's trying to achieve. And they're frustrated because they can't see what's happening. They can't see what's working, what's not working. They get reports, of course. It's usually on a yearly or quarterly basis where everybody comes together. But they want to see more about what's happening because they feel like they could help steer these decisions and remove blockers for the teams. And there's again, through the multiple layers of the organization. Down at the team level, they feel like they're constantly being shifted from here to there and not necessarily always understanding why the shift happened. And so there's reasons, but they don't always understand the why of like, why is this moving? Why is this happening? How is I'm working on these APIs. Why is that super important to the organization? And why did you just shift me from working on this to that? And so you get tidbits of why, but there's an alignment issue there where if we had planning every month, it probably wouldn't be an issue because one of the things that I always saw was like the plans were stale on demand. Like the organization would come together, here's our big plan for the quarter. Great. Everybody's on the same page. 2 weeks later, things have changed. Something shifted, something happened with the competitor. We acquired something, we did something. Now a lot of resources and things are being shifted and moved around and budgets are changing and we don't whatever the situation is. And so if we could get this big effort to just line up everybody every month, it would work, but that's just not how it works in practice. And so it leaves everybody flying a little bit blind. And then you've got people whose role is to try to connect those dots and keep them connected. I talk about it like human glue. There's these people who are going around and just asking like, what's happening? What's going on? What's the status? They talk to the leadership about what they want to do with this or that or something that's changed. And so it's this very dynamic and messy thing that's happening where we're trying to keep things aligned. And so that frustration is what led me. It's like, well, there's got to be a way where, and this is what, John Cutler, who I work with, calls forever problems. You never solve this completely, but it is something that if we could just get better at it, it would make everybody's life so much better because the teams understand why the things are moving and why their work matters. The leaders understand, okay, I can see we invested over here and made these bets and those seem to be working. Let's not wait till next year to double down on that. Let's move some things over there now versus continuing to invest in something that's clearly not working, right? And so that's kind of what got me interested in strategic alignment. It's just such an interesting opportunity to affect the outcomes. And it's, when you think about the concepts, it really comes down to how do we learn faster and how do we connect everything, right? How do we keep everything connected versus connecting and then disassembling and then connecting and then disassembling. And it's not so much a cultural issue. It's a visibility problem a lot of times. Like a lot of people talk about, well, it's the culture. People don't want to share. It's silos. There is some of that in organizations, but it's actually a structural problem.
Yeah.
Thousands and thousands of data points in flux, right? We're changing systems. We're moving pieces around. We're changing our processes or our ways of working. New players in and out, new leaders in and out. So it's a lot. And so that's kind of when it clicked. Like alignment isn't something you just say, hey, we're aligned. It's just this continual discipline you have to maintain. And then, recently, the last couple of years, you see organizations trying to adapt to what's happening with AI. And that just makes it even more kinetic and more dynamic, right? And so, really, really interesting problem space.
I mean, I'd love to kind of get into, as we kind of unpack the problem space before we get into the solution and what you guys are doing at .work. I'd love to kind of understand like what are the big driving forces that are making business and tech super dynamic right now? I mean, it just seems like I've been in this almost 30 years, right? And it's like the most dynamic. I'm at a different position than I was, 10, 20 years ago, but I can see more of that, certainly. So there's maybe a little bit of recency bias, but still, right, there is a lot of things pushing on business leaders and tech leaders and stuff like that. What are some of the things that you're talking to customers about that are like they're concerned about? You mentioned AI being a big one, but what else?
Well, yeah, I think there's several things going on. I think organizations are trying to run a little flatter,
Mm-hmm.
which I'm an advocate for that. It seems to make sense, right? If we can get the leaders and the people doing the things closer together, that seems to make sense. Like the loops would be shorter. The role of a lot of people that are in the middle were to connect the pieces. And so it's a little bit of the flatter you go, the less people you have working on connecting the parts. You put those layers in, it feels like you've got a lot more layers to go through. And so organizational design is a big piece of that. So we want to run flatter, but we also don't want all the layers of bureaucracy to go through when we need to make a decision. So that's one thing that I still see businesses contending with a lot, is like playing with their design. So, like I said, we used to think things just used to move slower. We used to be able to set our strategy yearly 20 years ago, and it kind of worked, but it's just not fast enough now. There is too much change, too many things happening. Tech is just driving so much opportunity and so much disruption it's changing all the time, is really the way it feels now. And so, the work is becoming more and more networked, and that's cool. Like it's a more of a network, and it's more dynamic, and we can do things faster and show progress faster, which is cool. A lot of the work we did with Agile to get teams to where they could deliver in much shorter batches is very useful. But the decisions are still managed in hierarchies. And so, like, how do we merge this network of hierarchical decisions and networks of work? And so that's one thing. I think information is another challenge. Like, there's just so much information in the organization, just volumes and volumes and volumes, and AI is helping us search it better. But it's also multiplying the data. And so the context of how the pieces fit together in some cases is getting harder and harder to get. Like, how does all this stuff fit together? What's really important out of all these things that are happening? There's just so much data out there. It's like if you use a Notion or a Confluence or one of those systems, and those are so cool and so dynamic, but there's so much information put into those on a daily basis. And I worked in an organization that was very heavily using one of those for everything. It was really hard to figure out what was going on without reading. And even if you have AI go read it, you don't know which one's the thing. Like, you could have 5 different perspectives on one decision from different people's viewpoints, and you don't know which one's the thing. Which one did we decide? What happened? How do we learn from it? Right? Connecting those pieces is still really hard from a speed perspective. And then, you asked about AI, like organizations are spending heavily on AI. And the bottleneck, it's not really capability. It's the alignment piece. That's still the recurring theme that just keeps coming back over and over. It's in some ways it's the same old stuff, right? It's like, how do we manage this complexity? How do we learn? How do we remember what we learned? How do we bake that into the next cycle? All those things. But the businesses are just more dynamic. They're just moving faster, swapping tools faster. Things are just there's just a lot of change.
Yeah. New leaders, like, one of the pressures we're really seeing is this desire for leaders to iterate on organizational design really quickly. And I'm not talking like riffs or anything like that. I'm just saying, hey, let's apply something like team topologies, and let's have platform teams to manage cognitive loads and increase the flow of our, streamlined teams like product teams and stuff like that. And one of the things we're seeing is like a real impediment to that is almost this return back to like consistency of practice. Like, can I take a bunch of talent from over here and move them quickly to be productive over here? Well, not really, because we don't have run books. We don't have, high level architect, we don't have the basic documentation or basic tooling in place that would let people onboard really quickly. So, it's kind of the speed of change is forcing out these new problems. Whereas before we might have laughed around, consistency may have not been our biggest driver, right? Now it's kind of coming back into place. So, we're certainly seeing this in the big clients that we're working with today. One thing I want to ask on that front is we have one client that's implementing a product operating model, and we'll get into what operating models and systems are and stuff like that in a minute. But the way they've chosen to go about it is to really almost paper prototype it and to use things like Google Slides and Sheets and Docs and stuff like that, or a big Google Workspace outfit, to kind of say, okay, this is our outcome-based roadmaps, and this is how we're going to set goals, and these are the components of our operating model. What are some of the downsides of kind of doing that, like DIY, scrappy approach, or maybe the pros and cons of that from your world? Because I'm sure you encounter that as like a lo-fi competitor to the work you're doing at Dot Work.
Yeah, yeah. And I think early on when you're trying to adopt something new, like if especially if you're not trying to do like a big bang across the whole org, like I think a scrappy approach is a good one. So if we're trying to learn something new and we're just using the tools that we have available so that we can test, if we wait for the frameworks and the tools and the whole answer to come to us, by the time that happens, we could have already had several cycles with product operating model to see how it works for us. And so I usually advocate for like pick part of the organization where we're going to do this and be super scrappy. That's great. And if you're not a really large organization, being scrappy like that with the tools and the spreadsheets and docs and low code tools can get you pretty far. And so I'm for it. I think that's great. But inevitably what happens is, okay, great. We're going to start using that model. Now we're part of a big organization who has lots of decisions to make across a lot of different vectors, right? They're very matrixed across all the different decisions and compliance and security. There's all these pieces. And so how do we plug back into the mothership so that the mothership can steer correctly, right? And that's where a lot of this stuff breaks down with spreadsheets. Like slides are just, slide decks, it's a great tool, but those are just snapshots in time. Like I like to think of like strategies like a movie. It's this thing that's happening. It has a lot of context. It's moving. There's a story. You don't get that from slides, and the slides are just a snapshot of a point in time, and really hard to keep memory if you're working with slides and a system that wasn't built to give you memory and to give you intelligence as you go. So like AI can jam out some beautiful slides really quickly, but it just can't maintain like the continuity across what's happening from cycle to cycle. And I love spreadsheets, but when it comes down to like relationships to the other things that you want to bring in to the picture, and intent behind the numbers that you're doing in a spreadsheet, that's also something that's really tough to do with that approach. And so, because what you end up with in those types of systems is like every planning cycle almost feels like you're starting from scratch. You're back to you've got your scrappy approach, but every time you're starting from scratch, you're not learning from the past. It's really hard to learn from the past. And like, again, if you're small, it can work, but like in a larger context, it's hard to see what experiments are working across a large organization. And so, those systems are nice because we can move fast, but there's a lot of cost that's actually goes with them. The tools themselves are cheap, but like, it usually ends up with slower decisions, lots of rework every planning cycle. And you just don't get the ROI that you would get from having like visibility across the organization and learning as you go.
Yeah, there's just so much, like, it's almost a cottage industry of manual effort it requires to kind of keep these either, very simple tools or even any tool ecosystem, together. I'm kind of curious, like, you're a tool maker, so this might be an interesting question for you, but what are the limits of tools, and where do people need to take the wheel, even in like a kind of the vision that you see for, how Dot Work is going to, take some of the toil out of the mission? Like, where do people fit into this? Even let's assume we have all the best tools in place and all that kind of stuff. Where do people need to take the wheel?
Yeah, well, yeah, just to back up to so like, it sounded like I was bagging on spreadsheets and docs and that approach a little bit. They definitely have their place, but like the other approach, which I've been involved with, let me bag on that one for a little bit. So, we've had this movement towards, bigger frameworks, and, I was working in the enterprise agility space, right? And the vision there was like, hey, we're going to build these systems that help connect all these things and align everything and kind of do a lot of what I've been talking about. And kind of what we learned from that first generation of the products. I think the fatal flaw, and there was a lot of good things that came out of Agile. There was a lot of misconceptions about how to do it where we made mistakes. So I think the biggest one was probably assuming that we're going to have like consistency and stability across the organization a little
Yep.
too much. So like if everybody works the same way and we're all lined up and we all use the same framework and the systems don't change a lot, then they can work. And I've seen them work. 9 times out of 10, the organizations were just too dynamic for that. They were moving around, changing the tools, like the stuff we've been talking about. It's really hard to fit into somebody's data model where they said, hey, here's a great model for you to run with. And if you work this way, the tool will work great for you. But as soon as you start to deviate from that, then you start to see the tool break down because it's built for one mode of operating, right? And there was always lots of toggles to flip, hey, we want to work this way or that way, but it's more dynamic than that. Thousands of different combinations of toggles and have a good system. And so, those systems, we were trying to optimize for the mechanics, but the decision loops were really hard to connect because you'd have part of the organization in the tool, part that wasn't, right? And so we really couldn't get there just because the tools weren't dynamic enough. And so, they basically scaled the process really well, but they didn't scale the understanding. That was the promise, is that we would understand how all these things connected and why and how it worked. So the problem with those was just the data models are somewhat static. And so if the organization doesn't work that way, then we struggle across portfolios and teams and strategies and IT and the business to connect the dots. And so that's really where the limitations of those tools come in. And you're never going to have, I don't think we should ever try to have a tool that just tells us what to do. Like, here's the decision. It's always going to be, giving us intelligence so that humans can take the wheel. And so, the idea would be like, if we can surface the data and surface the understanding of what we've done in the past, we should be able to make better decisions faster in the future, understand the trade-offs, and be able to, it's basically like understanding the consequences sooner so that humans are more confident with the data they have to make the decisions. That's really, I just wanted to touch on that a little bit about like, that's kind of, that was always kind of the choice. You either go with a system where they've made some assumptions for you that don't really fit your business well, or you go with the more dynamic, spreadsheet doc, but you lose memory. Feels like you're reconstructing every time you plan, and neither one was perfect for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. It feels like, just kind of back to the great flattening stuff that's happening now. It feels like there's a real opportunity for the right tool, wink, wink, nod, nod, to step in and kind of create time where there wasn't time before, to focus on the activities. Like, one of the things we're seeing is like, we're seeing investment around big agile frameworks. I won't name names, but we all know what that means, and like certification and training and stuff like that's just gone. I mean, it's basically gone. I mean, it's not being really, it's very rare to see that kind of stuff happening. We were never really a big part of that, but it's just interesting to see that go away. And you kind of got to wonder, like, okay, well, some of the benefits that go away with that, such as like coaching, who's going to do that? Who's going to do that kind of development? And if you have a manager that's just constantly, corralling memory and docs and files and stuff like that, that's time they could be spent, looking at the process of things like Deming by what method, working with people to help them kind of achieve their career goals that align to the needs of the business, things like that, right? So it's a tough problem because the resources are going down there, right? And then the time to do the manual toil stuff is then going up. As a result, we have to then try to mitigate that some way. That's just kind of how I'm thinking of it these days.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's fair.
Yeah. Yeah. And I just like, dude, like these big agile frameworks always assume this kind of clockwork universe that, had some kind of ordered component to it. And I think the key word for us is kind of moving to this embracing uncertainty, which is a good chance for us to talk about the uncertainty project that you co-created. Like what tell us a little bit about that project, your motivations for creating it, what it is. Like, what is the uncertainty project?
Yeah, the uncertainty project basically is just acknowledging the fact that like we're never going to have perfect information to make decisions. So like, how do we get better at making decisions in an organizational context? And the uncertainty project was like just bringing best practices to that problem. So if we think about it, like, when do we have enough information to make a really big bet? And how do we think about the smaller bets? And how do we think about, it's some of the basic stuff that you hear it and it makes total sense to you, but organizations implementing it sometimes is a little bit tougher to like see it come to bear. And it's, classic stuff like, one-way door, two-way door decisions, right? Like if we really think about a decision when it comes along, if it's easily reversed, we should just jam that decision and do an experiment right away and figure out if it works versus spending any more time talking about it. Like, let's just do a quick experiment. We'll do, next week we'll come back and we'll tell you what happened. And if it looks like it has legs or not. If it doesn't, we'll abandon it versus just spending so much time debating the issues. But then also having the awareness and the systems to say, well, this is a bigger bet. We really do need to have more process. So what does that look like? And still be able to make the decision and be able to figure out how to make some smaller bets on the way to the bigger bet, right? And that's just one example, but like it's just this huge library of and techniques around decision making. And it's really, I love it because when you think about business and like it all comes back, no matter what your role is in the organization, you're an engineer, it doesn't matter what your role is, the decision making piece is really key. And so like tuning up how we make decisions and just getting better at making decisions and managing risk is really what the uncertainty project's about. So a lot of people just collaborating on that.
Cool. I'll definitely put a link in the show notes to that. People want ton of very kind of valuable mini frameworks and resources that people can kind of check out and use to inform what they're doing.
Some of the stuff on bias was where I learned a lot. Like you think you know a lot about bias, but when you really dig into how bias works and you think about when you've had bias and like when you've seen it when we're making decisions, I think that's really instructive to understand the bias, about the bias library. That was one of my favorites in there.
You're never totally free of that. That's the thing is that, you think of like John Boyd's OODA loop. It's like that orient stage as you go around that loop is all about filtering what you see through that kind of bias. And I think it's some of that you can certainly mitigate. Some of that works in your favor. Some of that can be kind of enlightening to realize that's happening in you. Yeah, cool. We'll check out the Uncertainty project. I'll put it in the show notes. Like I said, I'd love to kind of get into the nerdy, like GUI center of the concepts that are, like at the center of .work. So before we kind of get into what you're doing and your vision, which is super compelling and interesting, I'd love to kind of unpack some of the more technical language that you use, like things like ontology, things like knowledge graph, things like operating model, or what you might be calling an operating system these days. What is all that stuff? How does it relate? I'm just a big ass question, right? But how do you think of those things and why are they valuable things to know before we get into the .work stuff?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm trying to think of how to make this as simple as I can. So like you could argue that every product has an ontology, right? But to me, an ontology where it's really valuable is like it's a shared language for how the organization thinks. And so how does the organization fit together? How does it think? And like what's interesting about an ontology is it changes all the time. And so it's not a static thing. The organization changes how all the pieces thinks. And and we use a knowledge graph, which is how those ideas stay connected over time. So it's like, how do we think? And then how do we connect that over time? And, the first generation of products that we're trying to solve for like strategy and OKRs and alignment and dependencies and planning, the ontology is kind of in there, but it's like hard coded into the model. And same thing with the knowledge graph piece. A lot of it, they were built on relational databases. You can flip some relationships from one to many or a few things here and there, but really the data structure for how those ideas stay connected over time is kind of wired. And so again, if you work around that, it can work for you. And so what I think is cool about an ontology is a flexible ontology, one where it's all about like being able to model something, right? Model how the organization, how it thinks, how it works, but then be able to change that. And so, and same thing with graph technology and on how these things stay connected. And those two things are very interrelated. You see everybody with AI, you kind of notice anybody who has AI going on, they're like, hey, we've got a graph over here to the side. And they're trying to pump all their data over to the graph because the graph is really built for relating things easily and being able to move those relationships around. And so it's, as I mentioned earlier, like we've got this, the way a lot of things happen in the organization is very networked. And so graphs are very great for that. But there's also hierarchies that are really key around people, work, time, money, dollars. And those tend to be more hierarchies. And so between ontology and knowledge graph, we get both. We can put it all together and we can also understand both sides of how the organization thinks and then how all these ideas and things are connecting over time. And so that's ontology, and I threw in knowledge graph there as well. But really the reason I love ontology is like, if you think about context, which is really what we're trying to get to, like a durable context, like what were the factors for why we did something and what did it look like when we made that decision or did the thing or budgeted or funded the thing? What was that context? And then is it durable? Can we get back to that context? So like a lot of times, we make a decision as a leadership team. We have context. We're in the room. We understand why we're doing it. We've got all the reasons. But then when you look back at that decision, months later, the context was different than it is now. So now we're changing the decision, but there were two contexts. And so what's so cool about the ontology with the knowledge graph is being able to have that durable context where we understand when we made the decision before, what were the factors? And then what are the factors now? That gives a lot of power to be able to like really cut through all the noise and say, hey, here's what the data looks like today. Here's what the data on the ground looked like then. Here's how all that data related back then. And it's just, it's a very nerdy problem under the hood. When you're making the decision, it's super helpful.
Yeah, it seems like version control would be a really tricky part of that. I mean, if you go and license a tool that helps you do OKRs or whatever, you kind of bend, like you were saying, you bend to the tool may have some level of customization, but you bend to the rules of the tool that you can't move. Right. But then if you're wanting to kind of evolve, like say how you do goal setting and maybe become more outcome oriented, those objectives might move to outcomes, which have a little bit of a different phrasing or treatment to them, but they started as objectives. So being able to kind of see when they switched, is that something you guys think about? Is that just,
absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. If you think about like, that's kind of been the problem. It's like with any product that's kind of built with kind of that old thinking, not built on right on top of a graph. The problem is, you can't change the data fast enough to keep up with the organization. And so like, you got to think about a report in a data lake or anything like that. You change how the organization's organized. You just change one part of it. And now those reports are broke.
Right.
And then you move to a new report. And so now we've lost the history of what the report looked like before with that data, right? So like, it's those problems. That's what's so cool about a flexible ontology and working straight with a knowledge graph is you can keep, and there is, graphs don't just natively let you kind of rewind the graph, but there is the ability to just kind of rewind, like what was the scenario here and what is it now? And that was kind of the North Star we had that we wanted to get to for doing really cool, predictability loops and intelligence and things that we want to do in the future.
Yeah. Awesome. So necessary. So it's really hard to do now. You kind of see in the software architecture side, for example, we've seen kind of this push toward event sourcing systems, as like essentially the whole state of the system comes from an audit trail, right? And you're able to go back. And if you make any changes, you just replay to that point and then play on the new, processors that will take care of the new event state and stuff like that. So it's like, it's kind of an interesting trend. I know this is super nerdy, right? But it's an interesting trend to see that happening on the business side when, that conversation started maybe 10 years ago in earnest on the engineering side. And maybe there's a little convergence there. Operating model, operating system. What's the difference? Why do you call it an operating system? I mean, what is an operating model, first of all?
And they're both, operating models are awesome. Like this is like how the thing should work, how work should flow. Like it's our idealized version of like, this is the thing of how it should work. And that's what frameworks are. They're these models. The system in my mind is like how it actually flows, like day to day, like what's actually happening. Like how's, we draw it this way, but like we're doing it this way. Like there's all these things happening that are outside of the way it's drawn on the slide. And most companies document and focus on the first part, like how they want it to work. And that's a good first piece. But the operating system, if we can observe that and understand exactly what's happening and how things are flowing, then from an organizational design perspective, and like you mentioned coaching earlier, like that would give coaches the ability to see the difference. Like it's like, this is how we think we're working. This is how we're actually working. This is how the system is morphing. And it gives us the chance to like look at that and say, okay, well, this is how we thought it worked. This is how things are actually working in different parts of the org. And we can actually look back at outcomes and say, hey, it looks like this one's working outside the system that we thought, but it's actually driving better outcomes. And that might tell us, hey, we need to do some organizational design over here because more of us need to try what they're doing. Maybe they're trying some way of working or, doing one of those scrappy things we were talking about earlier, right? So observing both is really important. But I think of the model as like the ideal, like how it should work or how we think it's going to work. And the system is like, what's the real thing? What's really going on here?
Yeah, I have to liken it to, I'll go with another architecture metaphor, right? It's like the model is the class diagrams and the component diagrams, and that's the static structure. And the system is like, okay, how these things interact or don't interact, or the kind of like bringing observability into the mix and saying, okay, what's actually happening compared to this model, and is it a better model, and do we have the capability to go tweak our model very quickly to leverage this new thing that we discovered in a better organizational design is absolutely 21st century capability, like
Absolutely.
it's really hard to do even now. Right. So, that's a good segue. Like, let's talk a little bit about dot work. Cause when I saw Cutler post hey, I'm joining dot work. I'm like, what's this about? When I dug into your site, I'm like, oh my God, this is the thing. Like, I was like, for a couple of years being like, wouldn't it be great if we could use AI to make this? And then, like, boom, this thing popped up dot work and immediately kind of hooked me, the vision. I would love to understand, we've seeded some of this obviously, but like, what are some of the unique problems you're trying to solve with dot work? What is it? What makes it kind of, it's hard to categorize like what you guys are doing in the milieu of B2B SaaS, but I'd love to just kind of hear your vision for dot work and what problems it solves.
Yeah, a few of the key problems. I mean, I mentioned one. It's just like, how do we keep strategy work, decisions, insights, outcomes? How do we keep everything connected as things change? And that last part, as things change, is really the hard part. So like lot of tools, and you and I could sit down on a part of a business and like map how those things are working right now for part of the business and say, here's how this thing works. But then the change part is really hard to keep connected. And so the one of the unique problems there is if we can keep those things connected, not only can we operate better, we can learn much, much faster. And with AI wired into that, there's so many opportunities to just streamline things that waste time and meetings and things that we don't want to do for more value focused work. Another one is like, how do we make alignment a true observable thing, not like an aspirational thing? So how can we understand where we're misaligned? How can we have a system that understands it and is keeping us aligned and focusing on, like one of the things we're trying to do is like get rid of data entry for the most part for like planning. So like you think about planning and status updates, there's just all these meetings and all this status and stuff. And we really don't have to do all of that now with the technology we have. So how can we make the alignment piece easier so that we actually do it? Make it observable. And then, this was always my biggest pet peeve with everything is like, we go through these planning cycles, we do all the work, and at the end of it, we don't take the learnings from what we're doing and funnel them back into the system. And it's not bad intent. It's just like, you think about, by the time you finish this quarter, you're already starting to plan for the next quarter. And like, where does the learning come in, right? It's all gut right now. It's like too much. And gut is very important. Like leaders' guts about what they think is happening and all that's great. But can we give them more information about what actually just happened and understand where the dollars went, where the effort went, where the good and the bad and the ugly of what we just did so that we can get better? And so that part is very lacking, and it's a data problem. It's just, if it's in sheets and decks and it gets put through 5 people's opinion before it gets presented to the exec, we're not going to get what we want there. And so that's some of the bigger problems that we're focused on. Is just, again, they sound like the old problems. They're, we want to get aligned. We want to plan better. We want to make better decisions. It's all the things that sound like familiar pain points. We're just taking a very different approach to them from a technology perspective. And our assumptions going in are very different. We're not assuming conformity. We're not assuming that there's this magic framework that's going to work for everyone. We're eyes wide open, probably because we just spent the last 10 years doing this in very large organizations.
Yeah. Yeah. So what's an example of something difficult that's currently difficult that if someone were to put dot work in place would become a little bit more doable, like kind of going down that simple ain't easy thing? Like where does dot work make that possible, or that give me a use case or two that you're targeting as part of your value prop?
Yeah, the ones I usually talk about are like understanding what's important, what matters right now, like across the whole org at different levels, at the top, at a product level, at an organizational portfolio level, what matters right now, what's important, right? Is it really easy to understand that? Or is that going to take us going back and say, we'll get back to you and we'll go figure out like what's most important at the moment? And usually you can get some high level answer, but like really understanding what's important right now and what's high impact right now is one thing that sounds simple, that really isn't simple in a large organization that we're trying to solve for. What are what are the second order impacts before they become really expensive, right? So like a lot of times something's happening and there's these side effects happening and we don't really see it till it's too late to do something about it and before we spend all the money. So how do we see that? Able to like pivot when we when it makes sense. A lot of times, the budgets get set, the plans get set, and we just run down those paths when we should be able to see way earlier, like something's not working or, hey, this is a great opportunity. We should pivot this direction. How are we able to do that effectively in an organization where we have large planning cycles and budgets and all those things? How can AI surface signals without overwhelming leaders? Like this is a classic one. Like we've just tried to push leaders to dashboards. We try to get like, especially senior leaders, try to get them to like log into new products. It's almost impossible. We have the ability now to like actually go see the things that matter to them in context and surface just those things and let them give us feedback about what they care about and internalize that and remember it. I kind of like to equate it to like, we're all using GPTs now and they're building memory about us. And it's impressive because we're feeding them so much stuff about what we care about and what we think. And it's almost like doing that for the organization, but also for the leader. We're able to we should be able to surface the signals to them without all the noise. And that's one of the challenges with this problem is like, there's so many moving pieces. Like, I don't know how many times I've logged into a piece of software and like, it's just constantly alerting me. It's like alarm, alert, look. And eventually you just stop looking because it's too noisy. And what we really want's what's the signal that really matters to me? I think we can get at it now, which is one of the problems we're trying to solve for. And again, where they work, not in a new tool. Like our vision for this eventually is we're more of a dark system where we're just like this intelligence context engine with memory about the organization. And we can tee it up to you in a very simple way without a lot of data entry, wherever you're working, GitHub, Slack, Teams, we don't care. We'll have a conversation with you and we'll help you make better decisions or answer questions or get what you need to do your job.
Nice.
And then, and if we can do that, that's going to lead us to be able to like help leaders ask better questions faster. Like, when I talk to leaders, they're like, help me look around corners. Help me see things earlier where I can help steer the organization. I think we finally have the pieces to be able to do that. And, all the things I went through there, those are not simple things to do. They're very complex in practice, but like we're getting there thanks to the things you asked me about, thanks to flexible ontologies, knowledge graphs, AI.
Yeah.
Really cool.
Yeah. It feels like, we're working on a couple big accounts now where it's like we're implementing like continuous planning and moving them away from like large batch to kind of PI planning where it's like they plan the whole quarter and then there's no real feedback mechanism in that quarter. You just deliver it and hope it works and you switch your goals and move on, to, we're actually pushing toward this user behavioral outcome and this is how we're going to influence it and we're going to kind of put some bets on that and see. And then we may change the outcome. We may change the metric. We may change certainly the scope that we're going after. And we want to do that within like weekly almost, right? Not like quarterly, right? And the discipline involved to do that. You can do it, but you really have to have like an accountability circle. You really have to have the training. You really have to ideally have some of those kind of tools in place to do it. And it's like, it takes up so much overhead to really get there. And I think one thing we've learned is like, even from like the old XP days, if we can make it automatic or if we can make the process like lean you toward doing it naturally, or you can see the benefit of it or make it easier, it's more likely to happen. It's just human nature, right? Counting on discipline is not a great strategy for these things. So I really love that. So the way I understand .work is this kind of, daemon software with you've got a nice UI and all that stuff, but it's like, it's running in the background. It's running on a ontology and a knowledge graph, and it maps into the various tools that you have, like tracking tools. Like it could be Jira over here. It could be Linear over here. It could be GitHub issues over here. And then other ones, right? Road mapping tools. And we start kind of going through the litany of tools. That's a lot of tools. Am I thinking about it the right way though? Just from a structural perspective and how you've architected, is that it's kind of this layer that integrates into those tools and brings their data into the ontology that you set up and knowledge graph that you set up in .work.
Yes, you are thinking of it correctly. So especially with like metrics, that's where we tend to touch a lot of systems because like really what we want for like the KPIs and the metrics, we want like live attention to those, like what's happening. Cause what we really want to be able to see is like, we're doing this, which needles are moving. And that's a It's a complicated problem because you've got some big goal you're trying to move, and then you're moving all these other little needle. I talk about needles like a
Yeah,
speedometer or
on the
something, but like,
gauge. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
like a gauge, but like, there's a big needle and then there's little needles, and then you're doing things to try to move little needles and how they relate to the big ones. And so all of that information does tend to touch quite a few systems. And we've learned a lot there. So like, I think the old thinking with how to solve this problem was we would build connectors and we would go connect all these systems. And what it ended up looking like from a data perspective, was like, we're going to pull all this data over to our system, and now it's in our system and we can query that data. And so, you build connectors and they're pretty heavy approaches, lots of mapping, lots of labeling, and you pull in all this information over. And what we found is like, you can do a few of those, but like, you can't do hundreds of those. It's just not practical to keep up with all that mapping and all those systems. And so the path that took us down, and this is another area where AI helped, and just some experience of doing this helped, is like, really, really a lot of times we're just trying to get at the number. So we bring over a bunch of data. We're bringing over all the data because we didn't know the questions that we wanted to ask. So we wanted to have the data on our side so that we could just ask data right there. What we're able to do now is take a more light approach. And this is where AI is cool. Like, it can, we're like, okay, we're going to go look at this system. Okay, great. We're going to scan all of the endpoints, understand it, have AI tell us what are the cool things that we can get from this data, and then say, hey, go get me, go run a proxy query and just bring me back the number that I need, and that's what I'm going to keep updated. And so it's a big nerdy long conversation for how we did it, but like, long story short, it's a more progressive approach. So like, don't go for all of the data unless you need all the data. Go for just the piece. Use some intelligence in there to make it easier to go get the piece. Make it easier for the user to just say, oh, I didn't know I could get that information from that system. I didn't know that endpoint was available. And when I say endpoint, you're just having a conversation with AI. Bring me back that data. Great. Keep that updated. Let me know if it changes. All of those things are possible. So yeah, it's a lighter weight approach. And there's some really cool, the technology's come a long way with that. So like, we used to struggle just with secure authentication and encryption to systems. Got a front door open source way to do that very securely to hundreds and hundreds of systems. I think we're like 600 out of the box, plus really easy to do another one. Like, each one's really easy to add. And then once the door's open, then using the generative stuff to be a lot smarter about how we get the data in.
Yeah.
That's kind of what we're up to. It's just new tools for an old problem.
Yep. Makes sense. Makes sense. Awesome. I think we're seeing the kind of current meta on AI is a lot of what I would say task-based unlocks, right? Essentially software engineering, code gen, right? Huge conversation happening there. A lot of tools. It's definitely, you see senior engineers, that are very public get red pilled on this stuff. I'm one of them. I think if you asked me a year ago, I would have had a very different answer than I do this year. But I see these like task level innovations, like essentially like, let's make this one piece of the value stream really quick. It seems like you're in a position with some of the conversations you're happening to give us some insights on like the larger problems to solve before we unlock like systemic level, AI wins, like around an AI powered operating model and stuff like that. And it seems like .work is trying to position to be helpful in that. But I'd love to just get your perspective on like, what are the larger problems that need to be solved to really get system level value or big impact value out of AI?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think I'm a huge fan and user of AI. So, there's some really awesome things it can do for different use cases that are obvious and fantastic. For this problem where we're talking about like organizational design or, operating models, an organization, like, it's the lifeblood of the organization. Like, how do they plan? How do they decide? What systems are they using? How's that all fit together? If you think of AI in that context, for it to do cool things, it needs a couple of things. One, it needs to understand memory and context. And, if you think about, well, where's the memory of an organization? Like, where does that live? Like, where do we get that? And like, what we've historically done is, we throw it all into a data lake or into a spot, hopefully, and then we try to build reports off of it. But there's no ontology sitting on top of that says, here's how the organization works and here's how things have been working. And so if we can get that, then you think about agents running around trying to help you do the repeatable stuff or the boring stuff, or like look through the data and find interesting things. If they have that context, it's fantastic. So, if you think about, you have this really intelligent AI or an agent, and you drop it in the middle of an organization, where's it going to go find the institutional knowledge of how it operates? So if you can do that, then it can understand who makes decisions, how decisions are made, how they're funded, what we've done before, what we recently changed, what's happening, and then we can do a lot more interesting things. And so it's always goes back to the data, and then like, probably the Uber concept on top of that is like the contextual data. Like, what's the context of this data so that the AI has the context. And that way, you see these commercials where everybody's like showing, all these software companies are like showing like AI agents sitting beside you and like being your
Yep.
coworker. And that's very cool. And like, there's some tasks where they can't. It's like, hey, go find this, go summarize this, go do this thing. But like, what if the thing sitting next to you actually understood the organization really well and understood the context of like who cared about what and what they were trying to achieve? It could do even more interesting things for you. And
Yeah.
so I
Well,
think that's where we see the biggest opportunity for AI is like, it's the example I gave you before. It's like, well, when I'm working with my GPT, it's learning a ton about me. What if I had an AI that was learning a ton about my org as well, sitting next to me, and
yeah.
put those two things together at work? And now I can do even more elaborate jobs, more interesting jobs, more high value jobs.
I love that vision. The amount of toil is dehumanizing. I think it's so I love the idea of using tech to kind of claim back some of that time. Maybe a good outro question here. Dot work. Fast forward, hopefully not too distant future, wildly successful. You're in all these Fortune 500 companies. It's saving leaders so much time. What do you hope leaders do with that surplus time?
Ooh, that's a good question. Hopefully be able to focus on, the interesting stuff. Like, what could we do? What should we build next? Like what's possible with AI? Like, those are the things everybody wants to spend time on, the more strategic stuff. You don't want to be sitting in another status meeting, another planning meeting. Like it's like, like fixing bugs is important. Ticking and tying all these things, compliance is important. All those things are important for your organization. You got to do them. But what if we had more help doing those things for us, simplifying those things for us, and then we could spend more time on how do we win? How do we build really cool things, right? That's what's exciting to me, because like you kind of, you know, in any organization you work for, you're there because you believe in the vision and you want to go whatever they're doing, whatever they're solving for, you want to go do the thing. But there's a big chunk of your job that you just have to do. It's just part of it, right? And you don't enjoy that, but it's just part of the thing. Like, what if the leaders could have fewer status meetings? What if they could ask questions and get answers right away? Like, what if they didn't have to wait for someone to go prepare a deck and go through a bunch of committees and checks just to get a question answered, right? Like, what if we could, I think you could imagine faster, you could experiment faster, you could learn faster. It's just, the competitive advantage would be fantastic. And so that's what I'm hoping we're able to be a part of for these organizations, is free people up to do the stuff they really wanted to do in the first place,
Awesome.
versus the corporate stuff that you kind of have to do. It'd be nice to do less of that.
Well, I'm ready to submit my application. Maybe I need to go be an engineer at Dot Work here. I totally buy the vision. Well, Steve Elliott, I want to thank you so much. I think we just kind of scratched the surface here, but I don't want to overwhelm our listeners. I think it's so cool what you guys are doing. As a partner, it's just really cool, kind of neat to see the extreme rapid progress that you're making on stuff. We hope to see more of that in the future. I want to thank you for joining us, Steve.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.